Passaria a palavra agora a Cath Collins, por favor.
Thank you. Thanks to the organisers for this invitation. It's a great pleasure for me to be back in Brazil, where I first learnt my trade as a volunteer in the Human Rights Office of the Archdiocese de Paraíba in 1991, frightening. Inspired partly, it must be said, by Jan Rocha's reporting of Brazil issues in The Guardian, so it's a great pleasure for me to see her here today. What I would like to do, I want to talk about truth commissions in the Southern Cone, but I don't intend to discuss country by country or to offer extensive comparative detail of mandates and powers. That information, I think, is in the public domain, and I know there's extensive expertise on it here in the room also. What I would like to do is to separate Latin America's Truth Commission experiences, not so much by country as by time period, and suggest that there are at least two identifiable phases in which truth and justice are officially dealt with, and that in this second phase, what's required is quite different and perhaps more demanding. I'm going to use slides. I know it's been a long day, so I'll give you photos and things to look at other than me. The first ones cover the early phase, and not all of the detail there is significant. So where there are tables, I've highlighted the main points. And for the text, as a help to the translators, I'll read the sections that are actually essential to translate. It's probably not essential or even wise, I think, to try and translate all of the text. So to begin and ask transition from what really is just to emphasize the very different pre-transitional conditions in the Southern Cone as compared with Central America and Peru, where the numbers are much higher and violence is less targeted. That's all we need to say there. And here, if we look at the region and the situation at transition, I've marked here, highlighted Uruguay, Brazil, and Paraguay. I know the numbers are always difficult. Numbers go up, and in the case of Chile, go down. But this is just a rough comparison. But Uruguay, Brazil, and Paraguay are countries whose small numbers, apparently small numbers of deaths and disappearance, of course, mark much more extensive use of torture and political imprisonment. And when we look at reasons why transition happened, here the essential thing at the end is this common feature. Although human rights is an issue and a dimension and part of the reason regimes go, it's not the only reason or the main reason why they go. And what that means is that there's arguably no lasting social consensus in any of the countries, I would argue, that rejects regimes and or specifically their human rights crimes. Argentina perhaps comes closest, but we don't really have that situation anywhere. What was tried in Latin America, well, we know. And we know that we're still in this early phase where justice was very scarce. We know that truth, justice, and reconciliation were the three main pretensions or dimensions of transitional justice. But it's always worth asking, what was actually achieved? And in the case of truth measures, I think that the idea that official acknowledgement was more important has to do with the fact that certainly for Chile, where repression was documented as it happened by human rights organizations, it's not so much what was said by the Truth Commission, it's the fact that the state said it. Okay. And yet, the force of the state being the body who now recognizes and sets forward official truth is very much weakened by the reception the Truth Commissions received from key actors. And just some examples, the Chilean Supreme Court criticized in the report, called it an absurd critique tinged with political passions. And in El Salvador, Mauricio Gutierrez, the president of the Supreme Court of El Salvador, said that only God could remove him from his post and refused to obey the supposedly binding recommendations of the UN Truth Commission. So I think we need to balance our appreciation of the strength of what state truth commissions do with a recognition that the key players don't always recognize them as real truth, as state-sponsored official truth. Justice, early justice and early reconciliation, I think we need to leave aside just for now. And just to come here to an early balance, this is the balance at an early stage. So at less than 5 years after transition for these early experiences. And things to note are that Brazil is the only case without some kind of early official truth process, even though Uruguay is very limited. And second thing to notice is that the later cases, Guatemala and Peru, have much more limited amnesty, or in the case of Peru, no amnesty at all. And here I think we can say that Latin America's early export model, the model of truth commissions and of transitional justice that made its way around the world, really the highlight here is point one. Latin America gives us what at least looks very like a truth for justice trade-off. You can have some truth, you can have some measure of truth through commissions, but then there will be impunity. And that's the pattern almost invariably in this early phase. And a quote here from Juan Mendes, who said, "They told us back then that the options were democracy or justice, but we couldn't have both." So to ask what's the role of truth-telling, what's the use of truth-telling in this early model, there are positive things to say. Sure, it reverses previous official denials. It restores something for some survivors and relatives, not for all. It establishes a common account, but as I say, we have to question that when we look at the reception of that supposedly official account, even by official actors and official bodies like the armed forces. On the negative side, the truth that was revealed by early truth commissions was always partial and almost never included access to military archives and documents. The truth was traumatic for some, it was actively dangerous for others, and in Central America, issues of witness protection were not dealt with as they ought to have been. The truth was refuted and was disputed by key actors. In Chile, the Mesa de Diálogo, a much later initiative in 1999 and 2000, the military arrived at the round table still talking about the supposed detenidos desaparecidos. They still weren't recognizing even that the detenidos desaparecidos existed, in spite of the intervening official truth commission. And truth in this early model was artificially divorced from consequences. Also, to refer to Eduardo's point about publicity and the publication of Truth Commission reports, in Chile, often cited as one of the more successful early commissions, the active promotion of the report nationally was cut dramatically short by the assassination of a right-wing senator just days after its publication. All subsequent official activities and presentation and promotion of the RETIC Truth Commission report in Chile were cancelled. And in that sense, I think that Peru's experience also shows us that it's not just what you do in the report, it's what you do with the report after that counts. The outcomes, having said that, of this first transitional phase, formal democracy is at least secured in most places. The depth and quality of that democracy, of course, become a subsequent issue. But also in some settings, continued violence is an issue, this link between past impunity and present violence. And the justice memory issue does not go away. It doesn't seem to be true that it's enough just to tell the truth. And what we now have, what we're now living through in the region, is a second phase that I would call post-transitional justice. As someone said this morning, it's not so important sometimes what we call things. But from the 1990s, we have a re-eruption, a renewed demand for addressing justice legacies in many countries in the region, and particularly in the Southern Cone. The interesting or the novel things about this second phase, it comes from civil society. It's not the state that's ever interested in revisiting these issues. It's always the state, it's always civil society, and it's usually a minority. We don't seem to have to wait for everyone to want this to happen. It's justice focused, and that has a lot to do with amnesty. But it also has very strong symbolic dimensions and also very strong truth-telling dimensions. What does post-transitional justice look like? It's commemorative, but it's also distinctively confrontational. And it's interesting here that we see the aesthetic, the traditional classic aesthetic of the placards of the disappeared. The placards are still here, but now the faces are different. The faces of the represores. What does this phase do to existing transitional settlements? Two things, I think. Firstly, the justice question is definitively broken open again. And secondly, I would say the link between truth and justice that Carolina talked about is restored in this second phase. We're seeing a generalized move towards change of previous justice settlements. And that's in two. We see that in two ways. Firstly, the later transitional settlements drop amnesty altogether. It stops being used as part of the formula. And secondly, the earlier settlements that did involve amnesty start to dismantle it. And here we have images from Uruguay, from Chile, of the trials that are now moving into this very active phase that Carolina described. Trials are now extensive in Argentina and Chile. They're incipient in Uruguay, and there's discussion in Paraguay. There have been trials already in Paraguay. Argentina has the highest number of former repressors in detention, but Chile has the highest total of finally sentenced, 54 former military agents, with over 500 more currently on trial. And just to look at each one of those two manifestations that I talked about, if we look at later settlements, later transitions, so transitions that happened after 1995, what do we see? We see that amnesty is either limited, as in the case of Guatemala, which recognizes international law limitations on what you can amnesty, and Peru and Paraguay, which simply don't have an amnesty law. So this is definitely a change of model. And secondly, we see the earlier settlements that are being picked apart. We see now in Argentina many trials. We see in Uruguay the beginning of trials, either 6 or 8 military officers in prison, 2 ex-presidents also in prison in Uruguay. Brazil, not yet. We'll see what happens. Chile, as I say, many. Salvador, still no. And there are particular things about the Central American context that make this difficult. But civil cases have moved ahead in the US over Salvador. In Guatemala, similarly, we have cases in Spain, but we don't yet have a successful case going ahead in Guatemala. Why is this happening? Different explanations are possible. Here's one, Catherine Sticking's explanation about norm convergence and the justice cascade. And the idea here is that this is happening in part, not exclusively, because impunity is just getting harder everywhere. We have advances in international law, we have diffusion of norms about human rights. But I think that's not enough. Firstly, international law suffers huge setbacks after 9/11. And secondly, the distribution of this change is uneven. We're seeing much more of it in the Southern Cone, much less of it in Central America. We need, I think, to look more locally for explanations of why this is moving and how far it's moving in the different countries. And I think here are some of the things that are making this news phase happen in the places where it is happening. Firstly is the need for truth, the need for more truth, the unanswered questions, the things the early commissions didn't or couldn't resolve. In Chile, over a third of the disappeared are still not found. Many of those who were found were misidentified, and that needs to be put right. In Peru, the worst, the most pessimistic human rights organization estimates of deaths were less than half the final victim total. So we have a total of almost 70,000 dead and disappeared people in Peru. The worst previous estimates were 30,000. And this is Carlos Iván de Gregory, one of the truth commissioners for Peru, says this is for him one of the most striking things of what happened in Peru. He says, here we have a situation where over 40,000 extra people, if you like, disappeared and no one noticed. Okay. How can this happen? Central America, similarly, many of the rural dead and disappeared just never officially existed. These are people who were never on state files in state record. So this is still a big unanswered question. I think the relative strength of the truth dimension in these new demands depends on where we are and depends, of course, on how much truth was previously established. In Chile, it has to do with the fact that over 1,000 people remain disappeared, and also the fact that the initial Truth Commission didn't talk about survivors. It's a glaring absence. They don't talk about the people who are more numerous, the people who are more potentially vocal, more potentially politically active, the people who survived political imprisonment and torture are simply not talked about in the first Truth Commission report, and that's one of the big reasons we need to do more later in Chile, and more is done later in Chile. In Argentina, a particular element of the truth debate that made it continue through is the abduction of children and forcible adoption of children. And that acts as an intergenerational hook, a reason why the next generation in Argentina collectively goes through a process of questioning its own identity and therefore of making very direct connections with the need for more truth in the present day. We have incidents of accidental truth, the kinds of revelations that come about whether the state decides to pursue them or not. The discovery of the terror archives in Paraguay in 1996. The confessions of Cilingo about the death flights in Argentina in the mid-1990s. And the Riggs Bank revelations, the revelations of Pinochet's secret bank accounts, which have nothing to do directly with human rights investigations in Chile, but are the product of US Senate investigations into money laundering in the United States. But all of these things feed back in unexpected ways into the truth debates in those countries. We have emblematic anniversaries, the kinds of activity and re-eruptions of activity that happened in Argentina and Chile around the 20th, the 25th, in Chile then the 30th anniversary of the coup. Unexpected numbers of people out in the streets, some idea that something is still missing. Incidents and accidents. We shouldn't forget that sometimes things just happen and we don't always know why. Pinochet decides to fly to London. Fujimori decides to fly to Chile. Carlos Castresana sees the Argentinian anniversary commemorations on TV and decides that he wants to investigate the possibilities of starting a case in Spain. Third country litigation, I think it's not the only factor, but it is important. What's been called superjudge syndrome, the Pinochet effect, the Garzón effect, Garzón, the Spanish judge, and maybe now the Condor effect. I think a regional version of this, these investigations that Carolina talked about, all of the countries now where Condor was active, I think apart from Brazil, have open legal cases, and that involves jurisdiction discussions, it involves requirements or requests for extradition, and if you don't extradite, you need to prosecute. Judicial change and reform. I have no images here. I couldn't find any photogenic judge moments. I apologize to any judges who may be here in the room. Another aspect of transparency and access to information laws, things that come about as part of general, more broad democratization processes or modernization or state reform processes. And I think it's important and interesting that other kinds of reform and change should have impact too in the area of human rights. Maybe it shouldn't or doesn't always have to be a special treatment for this special issue. So minimally, if you manage to create, after transition, a minimally independent and effective judiciary, it will start to resolve these issues, like all others, in accordance with international law. Political replacement, just changes of government. This has acted as a big stimulus to civil society claims, even when policy change has actually been very limited. So, Brazil, the PT in Brazil, the change of government in Chile, we've had successive concertación, center-left administrations ever since transition, but the entry of firstly Ricardo Lagos and then Michelle Bachelet as distinctively socialist party candidates certainly had an impact on what people expected. People expect more from these kinds of governments about this issue, and therefore, paradoxically, can be more critical about what they do and don't get. But it does provoke people to sit down and see what can be done. So in Uruguay, there's a small group of lawyers now pushing cases ahead in association, of course, with relatives. But the reason they sat down to discuss the possibility was the imminent change of presidency to Tabaré Vázquez. In the end, Vázquez was as pro-amnesty as the president before him had been, almost. But the impulse, the fact that regime was changing, was what made civil society sit down and take some action that hadn't previously been taken. We've had some state protagonism behind this, but it's been later, and it's, again, almost only in Argentina. Here we have Néstor Kirchner ordering the removal of portraits of the military junta from the main military academy in Buenos Aires. Not something, it should be said, we've seen anywhere else. Pinochet is still resplendent in all the military installations that I know in Chile, not that I know too many of them, I'm glad to say. I think another aspect of this new phase that's worth emphasizing, renewed attempts at truth for justice buy-offs of the kind we saw back in the early transitional period have not been successful in this new period, and they've had unintended consequences for the state. So in Chile, we had something called the Mesa de Diálogo in 1999-2000. Basically, the government convinced the military. They said, look, this issue is clearly not going away. Look at what's happened to Pinochet. We need something new from you. And the military said, okay, the problem is, ¿dónde están? The question we're always hearing, ¿dónde están, dónde están? So we'll sit down and we'll tell you where they are. We'll collect information about the location of the remaining disappeared. And there was, I think, a clear implicit message there of, we'll give you more truth and then you leave us alone. So this was a kind of attempt to re-channel the justice energies in a new direction. In the end, firstly, the military, I think, shot themselves in the foot, if that's an apt image to use, that they gave very poor and very contradictory and incomplete information. And secondly, of course, we had demand inflation. People then said, okay, now we want to know who did it and why they aren't in prison. And the military, I think, quite genuinely in some cases said, but you said you wanted to know where they are. We've told you, end of the story. It's not the end of the story, of course. And in fact, the MESA, the incomplete information, led to criminal charges for falsification and obstruction. So precisely the things the military wanted to avoid with this new process were catalyzed by the way that they handled it. Secondly, we have in 2003, 2004, the Valech Commission, I think the only example of a second official truth commission. This one was supposed to put right the absence in the first commission. So this time we were going to talk about torture, we were going to talk about political imprisonment, but testimonies were going to be sealed for 50 years and people were going to be actively prevented from using the information and the testimonies in the Valech Commission to feed into new criminal processes. But in fact, again, this wasn't possible. People realized that, okay, my testimony to the commission is sealed, but I can go and give the same testimony to a court. There's no reason why I shouldn't do that. And so, in fact, that's led indirectly to what's recently been the first successful case for torture, for survived human rights violations in Chile, a case called the AGA that concluded just a couple of weeks ago. In Uruguay as well, these hybrid efforts of the government to give some very limited truth and only about disappearances have been more criticized than praised. So the early investigative commission and the peace commission of 2000, really they're seen as so unsatisfactory at this stage that they've created more problems for governments than they have actually solved. It becomes clear you can't tapar el sol con un dedo once this movement gets underway. The effects of post-transitional justice where it's happened have included reactions. This is Julio Lopez. Julio Lopez disappeared in Argentina in 2006, a day after giving the testimony that led to the sentencing of one of the only two Argentine repressors currently serving a final sentence in prison. And we still don't know. So Julio Lopez is the first official case of disappearance in democracy in Argentina, and it's as a direct result of his testimony in the second phase. But we've also seen some clear and useful signs of progress brought about by the reopening of the truth and justice issue, but also by the emphasis on the combination of truth and justice. In Argentina, the armed forces made a clear acknowledgement, finally, of their responsibility and an implicit commitment to democratic values. And the role of truth and particularly justice processes in military reform, I think, should not be underestimated. These issues in Argentina and in Chile, where Pinochet's legacy is finally being placed into question, even for the civilian right and the armed forces, these issues, more truth and particularly trials, they have caused a generational change in armed forces discourse in Chile and Argentina. Do we need discourse to be matched by more action? Of course we do. But is it better to have this change? Of course it's better to have it. In Paraguay, and I think also Uruguay could be added there to the list, and almost the same list, that the Colorado partidocracia is clearly in decline, and the beginnings of discussions about how to dismantle the broader legacies of authoritarian periods. What I think all of these experiences where we've seen some movement share is a virtuous circle of judicial learning on international law that ought to spill over into other rights areas, and also a proof that justice need not be destabilizing. If it was ever true, what they told us, that you couldn't have democracy and justice, it's now clear that you can have those things. What do we learn? And here, these are literally just, I think, three sheets to finish, and I'll just read them. These are really just to state some conclusions. What do we learn? We learned that sequencing matters. It's not the same to do this in 2008, 2009 as it was to do it in 1990 and 91. So sequencing and timing matters. I think this old model of just truth and nothing more is obsolete. It doesn't work anymore. You can't do it in the same way. Truth-telling has become indivisible from justice and reparations. Truths are not only told by the state, and they don't only take the form of official prose. Where we've seen re-eruptions, we've seen a whole wave of cultural production, memorialization, all kinds of other ways in which truths are being told. So a state truth, in that context, may be less of a breakthrough, less a let's find some things we never knew, and more of an arbiter of versions, because as versions multiply, contradictions also multiply. And the status of official truth commission truth as judicial truth will definitely be put to the test in this new phase. There's no doubt about that. What are the implications for any new truth commission? Firstly, I think truth for amnesty deals are unlikely to work anymore, as I've said. Why? Because perpetrators won't trust them, and because private accountability actors who are currently pushing forward all of this activity where it's happening, they simply won't respect them, nor should they. Secondly, amnesty is anyway domestic blanket amnesty, being chipped away at by this principle of territoriality. If you apply amnesty to the crimes that happen in your country, another jurisdiction need not respect that amnesty, and increasingly is not prepared to do so. Truth-telling is also being socialized and regionalized and internationalized by testimonies and evidence from other jurisdictions, the declassification of US documents, confessions in the context of Operación Condor investigations. So this version of the military, we have no files, which is still their version in Chile, it wears increasingly thin. It's patently obvious that they do have files. And the fact that some states seem still unable, therefore, to exercise minimal democratic civilian authority over the military and get access to those files makes them risk looking democratically very weak. Truth-telling increasingly needs to serve multiple social purposes. As I've said, it's not something anymore you can seal off from consequences. And therefore, issues about evidence and standards of proof in official truth-telling become, if anything, more important than they were in those early phases. And the very last slide here, just to say what should states consider if embarking on a new official phase. Firstly, to exercise leadership and not to wait until you are pushed. The example here is Uruguay in 2000. Some of you will know the case, Juan Gelman, the Argentine author, in the search for his kidnapped granddaughter, insisting for years that she was in Uruguay, which turned out to be the case, but President Valle, for reasons that really aren't clear, refusing always to cooperate, refusing always to assist Juan Gelman in his search eventually was successful, and Valle paid very high political costs, and high costs in political credibility also, for what seemed to be a very unnecessary blocking of what was clearly a very legitimate demand from Juan Gelman. Secondly, to design a process that really does what you actually need. We've heard about this already. If the truth is not known, fine, let's uncover the truth. But where the truth is already known, church commissions, NGO records, have the truth, then acknowledge it, recognize what is already in the public arena. If the truth isn't just being hidden, then make it accessible. Force handovers, force other parts of the state to submit to civilian political authority. Thirdly, this matters not just in its own right, but because quality of institutions matter. If you want a modern justice sector, and all states in the region would say they do, then domestic blanket amnesty is indefensible and you need to dismantle it, even if it's just for that reason. Consider the human costs to witnesses, to the accused, more controversially, but we've had issues where the failure to respect defendants' rights in the present era, excessive enthusiasm has really set the justice cause back. And lastly, to recognize that you can't please some people any of the time. I don't mean to be flippant, but these are essentially unrightable wrongs. The state will always be criticized on all sides for what it does and doesn't do, but I think it's no longer an option to do nothing. Thank you.